Everyone in the high society of Manhattan knew that Richard Sterling was drowning in debt, but tonight, under the golden glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, he was doing his absolute best to pretend that his empire wasn't crumbling into dust. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume-aged scotch and the subtle, metallic tang of desperation that seemed to ooze from Richard's pores as he adjusted his tuxedo for the 100th time that hour. He knew that if this night didn't go exactly according to plan, the life he and his wife, Victoria, had enjoyed for 30 years, the penthouse overlooking Central Park, the summer home in the Hamptons, the private drivers, and the endless stream of designer clothes, would vanish as if it had never existed. The stakes were terrifyingly high because Richard had secretly gambled everything on one final merger, a desperate deal with a mysterious investment firm known as Vance Capital, an entity that had risen from nowhere to dominate the market with a strategy that was as aggressive as it was brilliant. Richard had never met the CEO of Vance Capital in person. All their negotiations had been conducted through high-priced lawyers and endless stacks of paperwork, but he had been promised that the new owner would be in attendance tonight to finalize the acquisition and sign the papers that would clear Richard's $20 million debt. He scanned the room with frantic eyes, looking for someone who looked like a savior, someone who looked like money, searching for an older white man in a bespoke Italian suit, or perhaps a young tech prodigy in a hoodie. But his eyes skipped right over the woman standing quietly near the marble fountain. Aaliyah Vance stood with the stillness of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, holding a glass of sparkling water, not because she didn't drink, but because she needed her mind to be razor sharp for what she was about to do. She was 35 years old, a black woman with skin that glowed under the warm lights and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 battles fought and won in boardrooms where men like Richard Sterling had tried to silence her. She wore a cream-colored silk suit that whispered luxury rather than screaming it, the kind of garment that cost more than most people's cars, but lacked the flashy logos that the insecurity of new money demanded. To the untrained eye, she looked simple, perhaps even invisible, and that was exactly how she wanted it, because Aaliyah had learned a long time ago that you never truly know a person until you see how they treat those they believe are beneath them. She was here tonight not just to sign a contract, but to perform a moral audit to see if the culture of Sterling Corporation was worth saving or if she should simply gut the company and sell it for parts. As she observed the room, she saw the waiters moving like ghosts, ignored by the guests they served, and she felt a familiar pang of empathy, because she remembered the days when she had cleaned floors to pay for her night classes, days when she had been invisible too. Suddenly, the peaceful observation was shattered by a voice that cut through the ambient jazz music like a serrated knife, a voice dripping with entitlement and annoyance that made Aaliyah's spine stiffen. "Excuse me, are you deaf or just incompetent?" The voice belonged to Victoria Sterling, Richard's wife, a woman who wore her wealth like armor, draped in a red sequined gown that was too tight and too loud, covered in diamonds that sparkled with a cold, hard light. Victoria was holding an empty wine glass, her face twisted into a mask of irritation as she glared at Aaliyah, her eyes scanning the cream suit and dismissing it instantly as a uniform. Victoria had spent her entire life surrounded by servants, and to her, anyone she didn't recognize, anyone who wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a ball gown, was simply background noise, a tool to be used and discarded. She thrust the empty glass toward Aaliyah's chest, the smell of expensive Cabernet wafting from her breath. "I have been signaling for a refill for 10 minutes, Victoria snapped, her voice rising so that the nearby guests turned to watch, sensing the drama. "My husband is paying a fortune for this catering service, and I expect better service than this. Take this, fill it up, and bring me some napkins immediately because I think a drop spilled on my shoe." Aaliyah didn't move, she didn't reach for the glass, and she didn't lower her eyes in submission. Instead, she looked Victoria dead in the eye, her expression calm, composed, and terrifyingly steady. "I think you are mistaken, ma'am," Aaliyah said, her voice smooth and low. carrying a natural authority that Victoria was too arrogant to recognize. "I do not work for the catering company, and I am not your waitress." The refusal hit Victoria like a physical slap, because in her world, people didn't say no to her. They scrambled to obey her every whim. The fact that this young woman, this stranger, dared to stand there and speak to her as an equal ignited a fire of rage in Victoria's chest that burned away all logic. She let out a laugh that sounded like glass breaking, a cruel, mocking sound meant to belittle the woman standing before her. "Don't lie to me," Victoria hissed, stepping closer, invading Aaliyah's personal space. "I know the help when I see them. You are standing by the bar, you are wearing a suit, and you are not drinking alcohol. It is obvious. Now to your job before I have you thrown out on the street." Aaliyah felt the eyes of the crowd on her. She saw the smirks of the wealthy guests who enjoyed seeing the staff put in their place, and she felt a deep, cold anger settling in her stomach. But she didn't lose control. She didn't shout. She simply held her ground. "I suggest you look closer, Mrs. Sterling," Aaliyah said, emphasizing the name to show she knew exactly who she was dealing with. "I am not your servant, and I am not here to serve you wine. I am here for business." That was the breaking point for Victoria, the moment her ego took over completely, blinding her to the danger she was in. Her face turned a blotchy red, her hands shook with fury, and she made a decision that would cost her everything. "You insolent, ungrateful little nobody," Victoria spat, her voice venomous. "You think you can speak to me like that in my own house? You think you are better than me? Let me teach you a lesson about your place in this world." And with a sneer of pure malice, Victoria tilted her glass, not by accident, but with deliberate, cruel intent. Part 2. Time seemed to slow down in the ballroom as the dark red liquid left the rim of the crystal glass, an arc of crimson that caught the light of the chandeliers before splashing violently against the pristine cream silk of Aaliyah's blazer. The wine soaked into the expensive fabric instantly, spreading like a dark, ugly wound across her chest, dripping down onto her waist and staining the white blouse beneath. The sound of the splash was soft, but in the sudden silence of the room, it sounded like a gunshot. The jazz band stopped playing, the conversations died in throats, and the clinking of silverware ceased as every single person in the room froze, their eyes locked on the shocking scene unfolding near the fountain. Aaliyah didn't gasp, she didn't jump back, and she didn't scream. She stood completely still, looking down at the ruin of her suit, feeling the cold, wet liquid seeping through to her skin, feeling the sticky humiliation clinging to her, but her face remained a mask of stone. She slowly raised her eyes to meet Victoria's, and the look she gave the older woman was not one of fear or shame, but of absolute, chilling clarity. Victoria stood there with a triumphant smirk on her face, believing she had won, believing she had successfully exerted her dominance over a rebellious servant. "Oops," Victoria said, her voice dripping with mock innocence that fooled absolutely no one. "Now look what you made me do. Go get cleaned up, get out of my sight, and don't bother coming back for your paycheck because you are fired." Aaliyah took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the wine that now covered her, and slowly reached into her pocket to pull out a clean, white handkerchief. She dabbed at the edge of the stain with methodical precision, her movements slow and deliberate, which only infuriated Victoria more. "Fired?" Aaliyah repeated softly, her voice carrying a strange weight in the silent room. "That is an extraordinarily interesting choice of words, Victoria." Before Victoria could respond with another insult, a desperate cry tore through the silence from across the room. "Victoria!" "No, stop!" It was Richard Sterling. He was sprinting across the ballroom floor, shoving past confused guests, knocking over a tray of champagne flutes that shattered loudly, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered on madness. He had seen the entire thing from the balcony, and in that moment, he had watched his entire life flash before his eyes, not as a memory, but as a future that was being incinerated by his wife's arrogance. He reached them breathless, panting heavily, his hands shaking as he grabbed Victoria's arm, not gently, but with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. "Richard, finally," Victoria scoffed, trying to pull her arm away, oblivious to her husband's panic. "Have security remove this incompetent girl immediately. She refused to serve me, she was rude, so I gave her a little reminder of who pays the bills around here." Richard didn't even look at his wife. He couldn't bear to, because looking at her meant facing the reality of what she had just done. Instead, he turned to Alia, and to the absolute shock of the hundreds of onlookers, the proud, arrogant CEO of Sterling Corporation bowed his head in a posture of complete submission. "Miss Vance," Richard choked out, his voice cracking, tears of panic welling in his eyes. "Miss Vance, oh my God, I am so sorry. Please, please tell me this didn't just happen. Please tell me I am hallucinating." Victoria frowned, the smirk slipping from her face as confusion began to cloud her arrogance. "Miss Vance?" she repeated, looking from her trembling husband to the wine-soaked woman. "Richard, why are you apologizing to the help? Why are you bowing to her?" Aaliyah ignored Victoria completely, keeping her gaze locked on Richard, her dark eyes drilling into his soul. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady and cold as steel. "We had a meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning to sign the acquisition papers. I came here tonight quietly because I wanted to see if the culture of this company was worth saving, if the people at the top had honor and respect." She gestured slowly to the red stain dominating her chest, a gesture that felt like a judge pointing to evidence. "I think I have my answer." Richard turned to his wife, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and grief. "Victoria, shut up. For once in your life, just shut up." He turned back to Aaliyah, wringing his hands. "This is Aaliyah Vance, Victoria. This is the CEO of Vance Capital. The woman who was buying our company. The woman who holds the deed to this building. The woman who owns our $20 million debt." The realization hit Victoria like a physical blow to the stomach. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor, but she didn't even flinch at the sound. "The owner?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Aaliyah took a step forward, the sound of her heels clicking on the marble echoing like a death knell. "You assumed I was a servant because of how I look," Aaliyah said, her voice rising just enough to be heard by every single person in the room. "You assumed you could humiliate me because you thought I had no power, no voice, no recourse. You looked at my skin, you looked at my suit, and you decided I was beneath you." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But power, Mrs. Sterling, is not about wearing a loud dress or holding a wine glass or screaming at people who cannot scream back. Power is character. Power is dignity, and yours? Yours is bankrupt." Victoria stammered, tears of fear starting to well in her eyes as the reality of her situation crashed down on her. I didn't know. It was a mistake. I thought ... I thought you were just ... You thought you were punching down." Aaliyah cut her off sharply. "And that is exactly the problem. It wouldn't have mattered if I was a waitress. It wouldn't have mattered if I was the janitor. You do not treat human beings like trash just because you pay them. I don't do business with people who treat dignity like a luxury item reserved only for the rich." She turned her gaze to Richard, who was now shaking uncontrollably. "The deal is off, Richard. I am pulling the offer." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, threatening to crush Richard Sterling under their weight. He fell to his knees right there on the ballroom floor, heedless of his expensive tuxedo, heedless of the dignity he was supposed to maintain. "No!" he cried out, grabbing at the air as if he could physically catch the words and shove them back into Aaliyah's mouth. "Miss Vance, please, you can't. The bank will foreclose on Monday morning. We will lose everything. This house, the cars, the company, my entire legacy. Please, don't let her stupidity destroy 500 jobs, my employees. They have families, they have mortgages. They shouldn't suffer because of this. Aaliyah stopped. She had already turned to leave, but those words 500 jobs made her pause. She looked around the room, past the gawking socialites, and saw the waiters, the bartenders, the security guards standing in the shadows. She saw the terror in their eyes. They knew that if Sterling Corp failed, they were the ones who would suffer first. She remembered why she had started her business in the first place, rising from poverty not to become another tyrant, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She turned back slowly, her expression softening just a fraction, but her eyes remained hard as flint when they landed on Victoria. "You are right about one thing, Richard," she said quietly. 500 innocent people shouldn't lose their livelihoods just because your wife has a small, cruel heart. She reached into the inner pocket of her ruined blazer and pulled out a folded document. It was slightly damp with wine at the edges, but the ink was dry and the terms were clear. "I will sign the deal," Aaliyah announced, and Richard let out a sob of relief so loud it echoed off the ceiling. "But," Aaliyah raised a finger, silencing him instantly, "the terms have changed, and they are non-negotiable." Richard nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. Anything you want." Aaliyah unfolded the paper. Clause 1. The purchase price drops by 20% immediately to cover the damage to my evening and the disrespect shown to my person. Richard winced. That was millions of dollars lost in a second, but he nodded. Agreed. Clause 2. Aaliyah turned her full attention to Victoria, who was trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Mrs. Sterling is removed from the board of directors effective immediately. She is banned from all company premises. She loses her company credit cards, and she is banned from any future company events. She will have no voice, no power, and no presence in my company." Victoria gasped, clutching her chest. "You can't. That's my life." "It was your life," Aaliyah corrected her coldly. "You forfeited it the moment you decided to treat people like dirt." She took a step closer to Victoria, her voice dropping to a whisper that was terrifyingly intimate. "And finally, Clause 3. You wanted a waitress, didn't you, Victoria?" Aaliyah pointed a manicured finger to the mess of broken glass and spilled red wine on the marble floor at their feet. "Clean it up," the crowd gasped. The silence was deafening. Victoria looked at Richard, her eyes pleading for him to intervene, to save her from this ultimate humiliation. "Richard?" she whispered. Richard looked at his wife, seeing her truly for the first time in years, her vanity, her cruelty, the way she had almost destroyed everything he built. His face hardened. "Do it," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Do it, Victoria. Or we lose everything. Pick it up." Slowly, painfully, Victoria Sterling, the woman who had ruled New York society with an iron fist, the woman who had never lifted a finger in her life, sank to her knees. Her red sequin dress pooled around her on the cold floor. Her hands, shaking and adorned with diamonds, reached out and began to pick up the sharp, wine-soaked shards of glass. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of shame. Aaliyah watched for a moment, not with joy, but with the solemn satisfaction of justice being served. She didn't stay to watch the end. She turned and walked toward the exit, the wine stain on her cream suit now looking less like a mark of shame and more like a badge of honor, a battle scar from a war she had decisively won. 6 months later, Sterling Corporation was thriving under new management. The toxicity was gone, replaced by a culture of respect and hard work. Richard Sterling retired quietly to a smaller house upstate. Victoria was never seen at a gala again. The shame of that night had exiled her from the society she so desperate craved. And Aaliyah? She kept the wine-stained silk suit. She framed it and hung it in her office, right behind her desk. She kept it not as a reminder of the humiliation, but of the victory. Every time she looked at it, she remembered the look on Victoria's face, and she remembered the lesson that had guided her entire life. So remember this story the next time you feel the urge to judge someone by their appearance. You never know who you are talking to. The person you try to step on today might be the one holding your future in their hands tomorrow. Respect costs nothing, but as Victoria Sterling learned, the lack of it can cost you everything. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Aaliyah's shoes? Would you have forgiven her, or would you have made her clean the floor?